Good morning, guys. Welcome back to the channel. I hope everyone is having an excellent day. I'm trying to do my best to have one as well. We're going to get into a cool video here, and I hope you like it. And it is going to be the 16-bit console wars. Who's the winners and who's the losers? Let's get right into it. So in the early 90s, Nintendo and Sega were still petering along and doing their thing. Sega had been sold in 1987, and it really did experience a resurgence in the console market with its release of the Genesis. Nintendo was riding high with the NES. They transitioned to the Super Nintendo. Again, hugely successful, and they just kept that momentum going. There was also some other players in this console generation. The TurboGrafx 16, which most consider not to be a true 16-bit console. It was a lot of marketing. I don't believe it actually was. I think it had some 16-bit elements in the graphics card, but the actual console itself wasn't 16-bit. So it was one of those gray areas where they kind of took advantage of that and marketed it as a 16-bit console. We had the ultra expensive Neo Geo, which, unless you were rich, you could not afford. I think this console was $700 or $800 back in the early 90s. That was a lot of money back then, guys. That would translate to probably like $2,000 now or something. So the average person wasn't buying this. It was more of a rental for video stores and stuff. I'd say the Neo Geo was probably the most powerful unit of all of these. The games generally looked better. There just wasn't that many of them. But we'll dive right into the TurboGrafx 16 on this one. Now, to me, this is probably the one of the bottom two losers of this generation. Collectible now. I personally think it looks neat. However, it looks dated for the time. And I think part of the TurboGrafx problem was when it came out in 87, and then it straddled the early 90s. So it was one of those consoles that was in between. It came out near the end of the 8-bit era, and then it overlapped into the 16-bit era. Now, don't get me wrong, it was a powerful machine for the 8-bit type consoles. Once it got into 16-bit, it kind of lagged behind, and that's probably why this was somewhat of a failure, I would say. For its lifespan, it did have a huge library of games. 678 games is the total amount that came out on the console over its lifespan, so that actually is pretty good. It did stick around for quite a while. It seems scarce here, so I think it probably sold better in Europe than it did in North America, guys. You don't see these around here too often. When you do, they are very expensive. I think you're going to be, $500 or $600 for one of these in a box, and then I'm going to say at least $300 for just a loose console by itself. Now, by the time the TurboGrafx petered out, sold about 5.5 million units, and then the CD-ROM attachment sold another 1 or 2 million units on top of it. So, not a commercial failure by any means, but for the lifespan it had, not a huge amount compared to the other consoles. So, will be in last place for me, although I think it's really interesting. The Neo Geo was the next on the list. Now, this kicked around till about 1997. And as I said, this came out at $649, give or take, US. So think about that in today's market, guys. Crazy amount of money for something like this in the early 90s. You could buy a beat up car for that much back then and drive it. Like, that's how crazy this was. Other electronics in the 90s were expensive too. Tube TVs were expensive, even VCRs and DVD players. So, it is what it is with some of this stuff. Electronics were generally expensive compared to what you made back then, but that's a whole different story that we don't need to get into. So the Neo Geo did end up selling about 1.18 million units. Now, I'm not too sure how many of these just went to video stores for rentals and that. I'm going to say the lion's share probably did. And that's why you just don't see these out in the wild. They didn't make a lot, and to find one of these in the box, it's probably going to be well over $1,000. I'm pretty sure I've done videos on these. And yeah, the games are expensive. The consoles are expensive because they actually are pretty rare and scarce now. The Neo Geo had about 156 games in the library, so that's not a huge amount, especially for this time period. Stuff like that held it back. I don't really understand what the reason behind this console was. Coming out at that time, if you lived during the early 90s like I did, that was high school days and working days for me. So that amount of money back then would have been absurdly expensive. I think the minimum wage back then was $6.85 an hour or something. Not a huge amount, and jobs were scarce back then. The economy was not great in the early 90s here in Canada anyways. I'm not too sure how it was down, my American friends across the pond. It might have been a different experience, but to me, the 90s was a depressed time in our area and my provinces, from what I could tell. So coming out with this hugely expensive console with limited games was just not a bright marketing move. And that's part of the reason this failed, guys. Mostly it just comes down to price. Yeah, the games were really good looking. They were awesome. But if people can't afford to buy them, they simply just will not buy them. I think this should be number 3 on my list. So really the battle was between Nintendo and Sega. My personal favorite is the Sega Genesis. However, I'm not going to let it sway the video, guys, just because, that's not the right thing to do, just because I like something better. In my opinion, Nintendo did win this war. Sega, very close second here. The Genesis did end up selling around 30 million units, which is quite a bit. They came out the first one, and then they had the second one, and then the Genesis 3. I've got all 3. I don't have boxes for any of them other than the Genesis 2, which is the least sought after one. The 3 is hard to find because obviously it was at the end of its legs there. I have all the consoles. I need the boxes. The one box I do have is really roachy, so I'm not really counting that. The Genesis did have an add-on. You could play the 32X games in it as well. So that did help prolong the life of this unit. And I really like the 32X. I really like the box style art, and I like the games for it. I think they're really neat. I'm definitely going to get into collecting those as well. So the Sega Genesis has about 876 games in its library. That is a huge amount of games. And I will say a lot of their IPs were pretty good. Everyone remembers Sonic and stuff like that. I really thought the Genesis was a better machine than the NES. I still felt Nintendo was a little bit behind graphics and the sound. Just something about booting up a Genesis game. The colors were so vibrant and rich, and the sound was okay. And maybe that's just because I owned one and my experience with the Nintendo was with friends and stuff. But the Nintendo stuff was out there everywhere. You go to like card shops and stuff or anywhere, any stores, they had them set up so you could play the shit out of these. Both were really good consoles in my opinion. To me, when Sega started adding the 32X, changing the consoles, to the 2 and then the 3, usually when companies start doing that, they're on a decline and they're trying to increase sales is what it seems to me. So maybe that's part of the reason they did that. I'm not too sure what the reasoning behind it was. I get the 32X add-on because you're, doubling the bits or whatever, but otherwise I didn't really see the necessity to go to the 2 and the 3. The 32X add-on sold about 800,000 units, guys, which is pretty good. The library is not too expansive from what I recall. So if you do want to collect this and a lot of the Genesis games, they are kind of expensive, especially the Genesis. It's really experienced a resurgence in my opinion. The games are getting really expensive on the platform. A collector of that and it being pretty much one of my favorite consoles, I'm really seeing that in the market now, so just be aware of that. Definitely going to say the Genesis in this category, guys. So obviously number 1 on the list, we got the Big Daddy here, the Super Nintendo. Now, the Super Nintendo came in, sold about 49 million units, so it took a bit of a dip in sales, but really, Sega selling 30 million units, you compare these two, this sold substantially more. So I call this a big win for Nintendo, and they really increased on their IPs during this time. Several Mario games kept going with the Zeldas and stuff like that, the Donkey Kongs and that. And adding the splash of the color to those games really helped them sell more units, guys. And this really started Nintendo's domination, in my opinion. They got it going with the first Nintendo, but this kept it going, and it just kept increasing from here to staggering amounts. Personally, this is one of my favorite consoles. I really like it. People will say the Master System and the NES was the golden age of consoles, and in some aspects it is. But to me, this is where the golden age started for consoles, in my opinion. This is where you could play the stuff at your home and it looked like the stuff in the arcade. And that, to me, is the real golden age. This is honestly what killed the arcades, unfortunately, guys. You can still smell the stale hot dogs from Max Milk and the cigars and the cigarettes of the dudes in the pool halls. And just an interesting time. It's probably why I have shitty lung capacity now, though. Anyways, enough of that. The Super Nintendo and the Sega Genesis brought the arcades home, and this is why, to me, this is probably one of the best generations of gaming that we'll ever see in our lifetime. I say hands down, the Super Nintendo's the winner here, guys, and it's pretty clear in my opinion. However, I am a Sega guy. And on that note, hope you guys enjoyed the video. Love the trips down memory lane. If you do, please comment, like, and subscribe. I really appreciate it, and we'll see you on the next one. Peace.